you're thinking. I find that with Lent, my focus just is not on history. And if I had not already prepared this before Lent began, we wouldn't have a class tonight. I'm wondering if anybody else is feeling like maybe Lent is not the best time to have some kind of class like this. Maybe it would be just a fall class, because that seems to be the time everybody's juices are going. But once Christmas comes, everybody's gearing up for Pascha, and especially everybody's gearing up for Pascha. You're doing confessions, you're doing pre-sanctifieds, Wednesday, Friday, Lenten Sunday afternoon, Vespers. I mean, it's just. So I'm thinking that maybe we'll just, if I won't say cancel, but we postpone the class. And if anybody has an objection, if you really would miss it, I guess let me know, because we have one more class at least scheduled, maybe two more classes. But I just don't have the time to prepare anything. I wonder if anybody else has any time to prepare anything. I think there is a way for us to do it.
We've got those long books to read. Somebody has to have a minute to read them.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that even so, so maybe we'll, I'm thinking, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, and I don't know if I expect an honest answer from you anyway, in public. So why don't we just decide that this will be the end, the last class for the Parish School of Theology until maybe next, I would even think in the summer, but the summer is also chopped up, vacations, some road trips, and especially me and my wife. Yeah, so I'm just thinking that, as I think back on the fall sessions we had at the Parish School of Orthodox Theology, I'm really pleased with what we did. I think that I'd like to work on the format of it more, but in terms of the substance that we covered, I'm really pleased with that. I think it was good stuff. But I just don't have the same juice for this semester that I had for the first semester. And I think it's just because everything's so broken up. We're trying to squeeze this into the Lenten schedule. It's just really hard for me. So, okay. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly being the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who are ever present, filling all things, treasure, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls over them. Christ is in our midst.
Yes, never shall.
We are talking about the history of the rise of the papacy from the perspective of the Christian East. The text that I am giving you the Reader's Digest version of is this one, The Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy. The specific years that he gives are 1071 to 1453, but we're just covering the first chapter, which is the Papal Reform movement. Talks about the historical, social conditions in Europe at the time that led to the Papal Reform movement, and it gives an explanation as to what the Reform movement was trying to accomplish and why it took the form and the shape that it did. So that's what I'm going to do this evening. Last time, 3 weeks ago, we talked about the Dictatus Papae, and we made some general observations surrounding it as by way of orientation to what we're doing tonight, which is to go over the history. So I don't have printed texts for you to follow, so I'm projecting the text onto the screen here. So at the time of this book's publication, Dr. Papadakis was professor of Byzantine history at the University of Maryland. He wrote extensively on Byzantine history, including Crisis in Byzantium. And this title is one of in a series of 4 that were edited by Father John Meindorf, who was my mentor at Fordham University. I matriculated at Fordham in 1982, and graduated in 1986. And then I went to St. Vlad's, because we became Orthodox under the influence of Father Meindorf and the students at St. Vladimir Seminary. St. Vladimir Seminary was just 15 minutes up the road from Fordham. So, and since my specialty was in Greek patristics, and Father Meindorf was my mentor, he taught in the history department at Fordham, but he was he taught the patristics at St. Vladimir. So all my patristics classes were done at most of them were done at St. Vlad's, the ones I took under Father Meindorf. Patristics, by the way, means the church fathers. I didn't have to do that. It means church fathers. In case you have not seen it, that's what it looks like. Pater, for father. So patristics would be the study of the writings of the Greek, of the church fathers. You have the Latin church fathers, you have the Greek church fathers, and then there's the patrology, which gives the life and a bit of the history of the fathers. Father Meindorf himself died from a sudden illness as a pancreatic cancer in 1992, shortly before I was assigned to St. Herman's. For me personally, these are not irrelevant facts of history, my history. Father Meindorf's passing and my assignment to St. Herman's are dominant features in the landscape of a 10-year period of my own biography. In these 10 years, from about 1981, when I was first made aware of Father John Meindorf from my church history professor at Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri, to 1992, when I was near the end of a path set for me by Father John, and was almost to the top of the mountain, and then chose to turn back and go back down to the valley of anonymity and obscurity, for the good of everyone, as events since then have made clear to me. My life took a number of unexpected turns, which of course dramatically, radically changed our life. Mother Nancy's and mine. Changes which have shaped the lives of our 5 children and soon to be 14 grandchildren, and who knows how many more. We're expecting at least 2 from Katie. 2 more from Katie. Father Meindorf was at the heart of those turns that landed me in my present assignment and status since 1992. Providence does indeed know what is good for us and for our salvation, and is most worthy of our complete gratitude and love. I say this reflecting back on what could have been if I had accepted that phone call from St. Vlad's and said yes. It would have been a disaster for everybody. As I began to say, this series was launched by Father John for the purpose of covering the history of the Church from the perspective of the Orthodox Church of the Christian East. In English, there is no shortage of such histories in Slavonic, Russian, Greek, and in the languages of other Eastern Orthodox countries. Father Meindorf was one of the principals at the heart of negotiations with Moscow that, after a number of years, were crowned with the granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly from the Moscow Synod of Bishops and established the Orthodox Church in America in 1976. I'm strongly considering, well, let's see, okay, this I don't need to tell you yet. We don't know if this is going to happen. The point I'm driving to make here is that Father John's labors to establish the Orthodox Church that was planted in America, with the arrival of St. Herman of Alaska and others from Moscow, sent by the Russian Church in 1776 to minister to the Russian traders and merchants living in Alaska as an autocephalous church. Who does not know what autocephaly means? Autocephaly means have your own head. So we run our own affairs. The Serbians, the Ukrainians, the Greeks, who else? Others like that. They have to go to their patriarch in the old country to get permission to do anything. If they want to ordain a bishop, they can't do that. They have to go to the patriarch in the old country. We are completely independent. That doesn't mean we are our own church. It means that we can run our own affairs. But I want you to see from this paragraph that the OCA, the Orthodox Church in America, traces her history back, her history here in America, back to 1776, when St. Herman of Alaska and those accompanying him were sent to Alaska to minister to the Russian traders and merchants that were living there. When the Orthodox Church was established in 1970, it was the newest of the jurisdictions in the history of the Orthodox Church. So Father Meindorf's work, he and Father Schmemann and a couple of others were at the forefront of these negotiations that have been going on for almost a decade before 1970, that finally ended in the granting of autocephaly to what was at that time the Metropolia. It was called the Greek Orthodox Russian Catholic Orthodox Church. And its roots went, going back to Moscow, through the mission in Alaska, going back through Moscow to Constantinople to Jerusalem. So that would be the pedigree of the OCA. From here to Alaska, to Moscow, to Constantinople, to Jerusalem. That's how we get back to the apostles historically. But the establishment of the autocephalous church, the Orthodox Church in America, illustrate Father John's love for America. And this 4-volume series was meant to educate Americans on the history of the church from a perspective undistorted by Western prejudices, rooted in the rise of the papacy and the Protestant so-called Reformation, that has affected Western historiography and has given a jaundiced, seriously distorted picture of the Apostolic Church's history. This point turns my head again to my days at Fordham University and St. Vladimir Seminary under Father John, the conviction of Father John's, and of the faculty of St. Vladimir Seminary, which in those days was where the fire burned hotly, that fueled the evangelistic vision of the OCA. It was the OCA's conviction and the principle of its life in those days that orthodoxy is not an Eastern peculiarity. It simply is the biblical faith of the church. Yes, in Eastern form, but it is not Byzantine. This was a point Father Meindorf made again and again, that orthodoxy is for everyone, because orthodoxy is the Christian faith. For me, it was this vision that demolished all barriers that were standing in the way for me and my family to be converted from the western desert of Christianity that I had been shaped into the Orthodox Christian faith. When I realized that there was an Orthodox Church in America and that I didn't have to become Russian or Greek to become Orthodox and become a member of the true and original Church of the Apostles, well, within a week of that discovery, we were at Divine Liturgy in Holy Apostles Orthodox Church, 10 minutes from our house in Saddlebrook, New Jersey. And the rest is history. See, we went on May 31st, Memorial Day Sunday. We thought that was a good day to leave the Church of the Nazarene, where we were active. And we never went back to the Nazarene Church. Never. And then on Christmas Day, 1983, about what would that be, 6 months later, 7 months?
The 18th of December.
That's it, yeah, the 18th of December, we were received into the Orthodox Church. At that time, my wife, me, Nancy, Sean, and Christina. So Dr. Papadakis introduces his study of this period of church history with some historical context important for appreciating how the papacy was reshaped into a papal monarchy. That's the word you want to focus on, a monarchy, demanding submission to its authority from the whole of Christendom in the 10th and 11th centuries. And this is what was unprecedented. Unprecedented. And it was built on fabricated claims and deceptions. In the Middle Ages, in both East and West, religion was inseparable from society and government. Treating ecclesiastical developments in isolation from their social or political context is virtually impossible. What happened in one sphere invariably could not but impinge and infect the other. Western suspicion and incomprehension of the Christian East that we find in the curricula and general attitudes of Roman Catholic and Protestant seminaries and churches and in colleges and universities today is visible already in this first millennium. How many we have? See, Stuart went to seminary. Who else? Stuart, I'm guessing your seminary is like mine. We went to, who did we go to? Maybe Constantine. And we skipped to the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah. And right to the fundamentals.
And right to the fundamentalists.
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps Papadakis does not go into the cause of this Western suspicion and incomprehension. Drawing from what I learned at Fort Eminence and St. Vladimir's Seminary under Father John Meyendorff, it lies at least in part to the uncivilized barbaric culture of Western Europe, and later the imperial pretensions of the Carolingians, in the way of which stood the established fact of the Byzantine Empire. The real Roman Emperor was sitting on the throne in Constantinople, the city built by Constantine on the Isthmus of Byzance in the 320s. Rome had long ceased to be the governmental center of Western Europe with the collapse of Rome in 410 by Alaric the Goth, followed by the Arian heresy that prevailed in Western Europe for some centuries. The Pope in Rome was the only significant remnant left of what had once been the Roman Empire in the West, before the capital of the Western Roman Empire had been moved to Milan, and then collapsed altogether under the barbarian invasions. With this collapse, Christian Europe de facto ceased to be a relevant factor in imperial politics, now limited, as far as Constantinople was concerned, to the Byzantine East. This is not to say that the Roman papacy was forgotten. The Christian ecumene, I think it's a conspiracy. The Christian ecumene, a world surrounding the Mediterranean had always and still viewed the Roman Pope as holding a primacy of honor in the church. Not just because the holy apostles Peter and Paul were martyred there, but perhaps more fundamentally for the very mundane reason, believe it or not, that it was the ancient capital of the Roman Empire. This is the scholar who points out this historical fact. The Pope's ratification of ecumenical canons and decisions and definitions of faith was always an essential piece in ecclesiastical politics. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, papal reformers, most all of them significantly Rhinelanders, from the northern lands of the old Carolingian self-styled Holy Roman Empire, as it was pretentiously and illegitimately called, because as I said, the Holy Roman Empire already existed in the East. And there was already a Roman emperor in Constantinople. Before, let's see, where did this sentence begin? In the 9th and 10th century, papal reformers, most all of them Rhinelanders, would hijack that primacy of honor, they're very much in keeping with the pretensions of their imperial agenda, to make it serve their intention of a papal monarchy that caught the Eastern bishops completely by surprise. And with the radical reformation of Christian theology that it produced, with the filioque at the heart of that. Filioque, that's the Latin for and the Son. Filio, Son, que, and. So, the filioque refers to that part in the Creed where it says, I believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son. That phrase, filioque, was added by the Western Church in the 10th century. And it rendered the last schism, located historically in 1054, irreparable. On this point, we might note that the schism in 1054 actually created not much of a stir. For one reason, it was not the first schism between Rome and Constantinople. There were countless schisms between Rome and Constantinople, but they were always healed. This last schism was not healed. And probably for two reasons. The one would be the filioque, and the second would be the pretensions of papal primacy. The general situation in Europe before 1000, Papadakis writes, now I'm on page 5, I told you this is the Reader's Digest version. In other words, I'm just copying and pasting from the book. Was of widespread disunity and disintegration in virtually every sphere. Charlemagne's reign was only a temporary interval in the expansive confusion and decline that set in soon after the collapse of Rome and the Germanic Völkerwanderung, barbarian emigrations. This tendency toward political fragmentation and regionalism gained momentum after Charlemagne's death in 814, in the civil wars and partitions that followed, producing this significant outcome. It was not Charlemagne's heirs, but the great landowners and magnates who took advantage of the political chaos to become even more autonomous than they were before. They gained the most from the dynastic disputes and confusions following Charlemagne's death. Semi-independent feudal principalities and even petty kingdoms were the result. To the prevailing insecurity and instability was soon added the pressure of new large-scale invasions. Waves of Vikings, Magyars, and Arabs poured into Europe from virtually every side and continued for decades, destroying life and property, resulting in the rebarbarization of Europe after it had been Christianized, right, by the Roman Pope. St. Gregory sending St. Augustine to the Celts. When was that? The 6th century, 5th century? No, he was 590 to 610. So obviously it'd be during that time. Monastic foundations in some areas all but vanished. Again, the real advantage lay with the territorial lord. He was the only effective opposition to the invaders at the local level. But this only reinforced the tendency toward autonomy and localization. Europe therefore became a negligible backwater. It became even more landlocked as lines of communication, trade, and travel were endangered and disrupted if they did not entirely disappear. People sought for protection and safety in the stronger landlords and magnates, and by gathering close together in greater numbers in large communities, leaving the countryside unpopulated and uncultivated. This, of course, produced an artificial overpopulation that in turn produced increased famine and poverty. Theological creativity and intellectual learning barely survived. Ecclesiastical discipline and morality collapsed. Sexual incontinence and simony, which would be the purchase of ecclesiastical offices that would be awarded to the highest bidder, spread unchecked among the Western clergy. The church was unable to escape the corrosive effects of feudalization and the prevailing chaos. One of the major casualties was Rome itself. In the 10th century, it was rare for the papal incumbent to be more than the plaything of the city's feudal factions. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the breakdown of European society seemed final and irreversible. But in fact, by the late 900s, the worst was over. The former invaders began to settle permanently and to convert to Christianity. Fear of unexpected attacks from the outside subsided, making possible the emergence of some order, recovery, and even rebuilding. Here's my note. This is not Papadakis. One wonders if much of this energy, for recovery and rebuilding, you wonder if it came from the former invaders, rechanneling their energies from destruction now to constructing their new home. By the early 11th century, a seemingly limitless restlessness, dynamism, and drive had become characteristic of Western society. Again, I wonder to what degree is this attributable to the barbarians. This is the energy of the barbarians. They had to do something. They couldn't go around marauding anymore. So why not stay home and build? This new stability generated a sharp rise in population. Suffice it to say that without this new expanding birth rate, the subsequent High Middle Ages revival, with its growth of trade and commerce, education, urban culture, and the rise of towns and political reorganization, is difficult to imagine. People began to leave their crowded neighborhoods. New agricultural settlements started. This was accompanied by a building boom that included the multiplying of churches and monasteries. And this is a note that I wrote, a scholia, that I wrote in the margin of my text by Papadakis. Note how the church provides hope that inspires creativity and life. The barbarians became Christian. And in the joy of the gospel, the hope that the gospel gives, it unleashed their energy. As life expectancy and population took an upward turn, stimulated by the security and increased productivity, so did Europe's confidence and self-reliance. Inner consolidation generated by the new developments in the West were to give European society a new identity, even destiny. An increasing homogeneous Latin Christendom was taking shape for the first time. But it would be some time before anyone in the East would appreciate or understand the importance of a confident and resurgent Europe. Actually, the Byzantine state at the time was at the height of its own power. Its political and intellectual superiority had no rivals. Byzantium was consciously proud of its preeminence, hence its attitude of contempt and indifference toward things Western. For Byzantium, Western Europe simply did not exist. In general terms, the confidence enjoyed by the Byzantine world as a whole also explains its frequent ignorance of ecclesiastical developments in the West since the late 9th century. No doubt the factionalism and moral chaos in Rome at the time only reinforced Byzantine indifference and lack of knowledge. Constantinople, time and again, was unaware of who the rightful papal incumbent was, because oftentimes there'd be several claimants to the papacy. Even so, no human community is immune to disruption and change. By the end of the 11th century, Byzantium's internal stability and economic prosperity were foundering, as social and political disintegration set in. In the final analysis, it will be the dynamic and expansionary West that would dominate, impinging on the Byzantine world in ways unthinkable before the 11th century. In the Latin West, the powerful Gregorian reform of the Church paralleled Europe's general transformation and rejuvenation. Gregorian refers to is the name of the Pope who was attributed with the beginning of the papal reform movement, although it wasn't Pope Gregory. I think it was Pope Leo, his predecessor. The fundamental changes in the See of Rome, which the Gregorian reformers were to generate, were especially foreboding for the Christian East. For the most part, before this revival, the Byzantine government was able to ignore the papacy as a power. A weak and incompetent papal court, incapable until then of sustaining its prestige or its claims, was seldom useful to the Byzantines. The reform, however, was to transform the papacy into an independent political power in its own right. Byzantium was forced to deal with this new international entity, not to mention a papally reorganized and controlled Europe. Notice this, that Europe's resurgence was reorganized and controlled by the Pope. It was the Pope who was the leading, who was the driving force in the reorganization and the rebuilding of Europe. The other side of the Gregorian Revolution, the theological and the ecclesiological, was no less momentous. Actually, problems began to surface early in the century, before the launching of the Gregorian movement itself, which would be in the mid-10th century. The sudden decision to alter the common creed was serious. The step was taken in 1014, when the filioque formula was accepted by the Roman bishop for the first time. Until then, the bishop, that means the Roman Pope, until then, the Western Patriarchate, the papacy, had in actual fact faithfully adhered to the previous decision of the Church Universal, expressly prohibiting any addition. This is one reason why this is such a big deal for the East. No one bishop has the authority to overturn a decision of the Church. The creed was ratified, it was adopted by the 318 Holy Fathers of the First Ecumenical Council, and then again, whatever the number was, 180 or so, 160 Holy Fathers at the Second Ecumenical Council. And I think it was at the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, where it was expressly stated that no one, no one is to add to the creed without anathema, being anathematized. And here's Rome doing it. If this interpolation of the text of the creed was unilateral and illegal for the Byzantine world, it was also theologically ill-advised. For it was then possible for the first time to identify with the creed itself a clear and unmistakable doctrinal difference between the churches. You know, to put that into your head. That's something to stick. Now you have two different creeds. Before you'd have two different, you have a Western Church, Eastern Church. There'd be significant differences between the two for social reasons, cultural reasons, but they both confess the same faith. Now, not only do you have two different churches, you have two different faiths. The decisive change in the Roman Church was the unprecedented transformation of its legitimate primacy, it had a legitimate primacy, the primacy of honor, into monarchy. The theoreticians of the Gregorian movement were to devise a new ecclesiological model in which Rome was conceived legalistically and juridically as the head and mother of the churches. Although this new papalism was to prove a source of strength for the West, in the East it was repeatedly denounced as an inadmissible pretension, as unacceptable as the unauthorized formula of the Filioque. Byzantium was unwilling to exchange or surrender its traditional autonomy for Gregorian authoritarianism. Indeed, the autocratic basis of the new ecclesiology, in contrast with Eastern Christendom's traditional collegial and synodal structure, left little room for accommodation or compromise. The shrill demand of the Roman Church for submission was to become an invariable feature governing its relations with Byzantium. Go back to Archbishop Daniel's talk to us, talking about the canons. You remember what he said about the bishop administering the canons. The bishop, any bishop in the Orthodox Church, when he's elevated, when he's consecrated, swears allegiance to the tradition of the church. And the canons are interpreted conciliarly, according by the synod of the bishops. No one bishop can assert his claim on any one canon. And so, to me, I was invited a number of years ago to the elevation of Father Pichet to auxiliary bishop under Bishop Nienstadt of the Roman Church here in the Twin Cities. So I had a front row seat, and I was very much struck by two things. One, all the priests and the bishop were on a stage. Everybody else was, of course, out in the audience. It was like a theater. And there was this huge, it was in St. John, Ireland Cathedral, right in St. Paul. So if you've been there, you know that there's this huge crucifix. Must be 6-7 stories high at the back of the altar. Well, of course, the bishop, all the bishops and priests that were on the stage doing their service, their backs were turned to the crucifix, to the cross of Christ. And everything took place with Christ outside the circle. I thought that was a significant image. And then the second thing that struck me was that I noticed that when Father Pichet was elevated and consecrated as the auxiliary bishop to Bishop Nienstadt, he was required to swear an oath of allegiance to the Pope. You go to the consecration of a bishop in the Orthodox Church, he swears allegiance to the tradition of the church, not to one bishop. The primary objective of the papal reform movement of the 11th century was the revitalization, even reconstitution of Western Christianity on new ecclesiological foundations. The results of the movement were revolutionary. The church in feudal society. Michael, you think we might need to focus that a bit? Well, it's a little blurry. I wonder if we can tighten the focus a bit. The fundamental problem facing the Latin Church in the 11th century was its almost total absorption by feudal society. The origins of this assimilation and laicization of the church stem from the appropriation and confiscation of church properties and revenues by the early Carolingians. Nominations to ecclesiastical office ceased to be a canonical or ecclesiastical matter and became instead a virtual monopoly of the secular power. So how to explain the phenomenon of royal episcopal appointments and the willingness of the church to sanction them? Monarchy or theocratic kingship contains the answer. The king claimed to rule by divine right was accepted by all as an established doctrine. In the 700s, Western churchmen promoted the notion from Old Testament sources that rulers were the Lord's anointed and the vicars of Christ. The office of king came to be viewed as sacred, conferred by God, and its occupant was raised to be equal of the clergy by virtue of his anointing during the coronation ceremony. Indeed, a king could be said to be on the same level as a bishop, and arguably was capable even of sharing the episcopal office. The seed of papal monarchy may be found articulated in Europe's long-held sentiments expressed by the 11th century Anonymous of York. This is a quote now. Kings and priests have a common unction of holy oil, a common spirit of sanctification. The name and power of God and Christ they have in common. If therefore the king and the priest are both by grace God's and Christ's of the Lord, whatever they do by virtue of this grace is not done by a man, but by a God and a Christ of the Lord. And when the king gives a bishopric or a priest a kingdom, it is not a man who gives, but God and a Christ of the Lord. Together with the consequence of the new local church system that developed in the early Middle Ages under the influence of German legal procedure and practice, the Eigenkirchentum, or the proprietary church system, an arrangement by which the parish with all its appurtenances became the private property of its founder or purchaser. So there's one reason why Archbishop Paul of blessed memory here of our diocese of the Midwest would not permit a layperson in our diocese to build a church on his property with his own money, because then it would be his church. The bishop would not allow that. In other words, that's an example of the Eigenkirchentum, a proprietary church. Everything built on a plot of land, whether it was the local parish church or a monastery, would be considered the exclusive property of the landlord, like this church that would be built on this man's property. It would be his building, his property, not the church's. The man who had built and endowed it was also its real owner, not the bishop, but the man who had built it. This meant that the resident priest of the Eigenkirche was in practice appointed and dismissed by the proprietor. In other words, not by the bishop, but by the fellow who owns the land. And if he was married or living in concubinage, common in this area, he was able to pass the parish on to his son or heir. De facto, the relationship of the parish priest to his ecclesiastical superior had changed. The priest's private arrangement with the lord of the parish had, in fact, replaced the canonical bond uniting him to his bishop. This had the consequence of making simony, elevation to a clerical rank by paying for it. So you understand, when in the Orthodox Church, when a man is elevated, to the diaconate, or to the priesthood, or to the bishop, what do we sing? Axios, axios, axios. He is worthy. He is worthy. He is worthy. So, but that's not why he is in this system. He would not be elevated to clerical rank because he's worthy. That's because he paid for it. In other words, he's rich enough to buy it. It had the consequence of making simony virtually unavoidable. And the general rule, once clerical offices began to be treated like secular appointments, made that to be the general rule. It goes without saying that as a result, in the West, priests in the West were often unworthy and unsuitable for priestly office, and also unchaste. Very few felt bound by rules of the Latin ecclesiastical discipline. Canonical rulings and papal decrees of the 4th and 5th centuries establishing clerical celibacy in the West were either disregarded or consigned to complete oblivion. Notice that this is when clerical celibacy developed in the West, in the 4th and 5th centuries. In fact, it was raised in the East. But guess who shot it down? A monastic. St. Paphnutius argued against it and defeated it. Relaxation of morals became characteristic of all the clerical ranks, top to bottom. and the monastics and their abbots as well. Marriage, concubinage, and simple cohabitation without legal or formal marriage were typical ways by which the obligation of celibacy was repeatedly breached throughout Europe. It seems to me, this is my comment apparently, there's another scholia. It seems to me very possible, or be scholium, wouldn't it? Is it scholium? Scholium. Oh, it's Greek. Okay, this is scholium. It seems to me very possible that the Eigenkirche was a model of the papal reform movement, according to which the Pope viewed the whole church as his own Eigenkirche. Suddenly the papacy was turned into a sort of imperial Eigenkirche of the German crown, when Otto I, on February 2nd, 962, compelled the Pope to revive the defunct Carolingian Roman Empire by having himself crowned emperor. The king then proclaimed that all future papal incumbents would have to take an oath of allegiance to his envoy before taking office. This is lay investiture at the top. It looks like this is what would be turned on its head when the newly formed papal monarchy would take the emperor and all of Europe and make it all of that his own Eigenkirche. And I'm thinking that this is also the seed of what I saw at the elevation of Bishop Wesche, when he swore allegiance not to the king, but to the Pope. In other words, that old formula of swearing allegiance to the king under the Gregorian papal reform movement was simply substituted for swearing allegiance to the Pope, as though the Pope is the king. Yeah, in fact, the Pope would assert himself above even the king in the Gregorian papal reform movement. So lay investiture, a layman, an aristocrat, or a landowner, a king, etc., installs to ecclesiastical office in which the secular lord invests a bishop, for example, with the ring and pastoral staff, the spiritual symbols of his ecclesiastical office. In other words, this is what lay investiture is. When a layman installs someone to the office of bishop, or invests him with the spiritual symbols of his ecclesiastical office. Not the Pope, not the bishop, but a layman does that. This was another societal force in the decadence of ecclesiastical life in the West. Although the general situation in the West was responsible in the main for the ecclesiastical decline briefly described, the inertia and indifference of the papacy were also contributing factors. During this time, the 10th century, the bankruptcy of the papacy is often called a period of pornocracy. And yet, significantly, the reputation and prestige of the city of Rome was not itself affected. Rome was still the mother church of Western Christendom, where Saints Peter and Paul had died. Remarkably, the operation of the papal chancery and the long tradition of papal administration remained largely unaffected by the incompetence of Rome's bishops. The wheels of government continued to turn as usual. This would be of crucial importance to the papal reformers of the 11th century for carrying out their program. This is when the papacy's dependence on the Rhinelanders or Germans was consolidated, more than on the aristocratic factions of Rome. On February 2nd, 962, the German King Otto compelled the Pope to revive the defunct Carolingian Roman Empire by having himself crowned emperor. To ensure the subservience of the papacy to himself and the new empire, the king then proclaimed that all future papal incumbents must take an oath of allegiance to his envoy before taking office. In fact, the Romans were no longer to choose or elect the Pope without German imperial authorization. The papacy was suddenly turned into a sort of imperial Eigenkirche, or vicarage, of the German crown. I want you to see how the center of gravity is shifting from Rome to Germany. The Pope was to be the instrument and even the pawn of the Germans as opposed to the Romans. The highest ecclesiastic in Latin Christendom had become an imperial official, the status actually possessed at the time by most German bishops. So this is one of the historical evidences that support the thesis that was presented several decades ago, that the Protestant Reformation, that the split of Christendom is not so much between East and West, but between North and South. because you see, in the Protestant Reformation, all those countries that had been part of the old Roman Empire around the Mediterranean, they remained loyal to Rome. Whereas it was the countries in the north, that were not part of the old Roman Empire. Those were the countries that went their own way and went with the Protestants. The papacy came to be viewed as chief chaplain to German imperial authority. This opened the way for the revival of German theological influence at the papal court. This is most obvious with the Filioque. After 962, the papacy began to waver in its resistance to the insertion of the clause into the creed. At the coronation of German Emperor Henry II, the formula was introduced into Rome as well. This was a good example of the triumph of German theology south of the Alps after Otto's coronation. Many of the agents of the Gregorian reform, that is just around the corner now, were of German origin or members of the German episcopate. In fact, the ideology of the Reformation will be implemented, I think this is of the Papal Reformation, not the Protestant Reformation, but the Papal Reformation that's just around the corner, will be implemented initially almost entirely by an inner circle of non-Roman northerners, the Rhinelanders, the Germans. The Father Meyendorff agreed with the thesis, I already said this, that the division of the church was north-south, not between east and west. The seeds of that are visible here in the rise of the papal monarchy crafted by these German Rhinelander popes. Given how bleak and widespread was clerical abuse, the product in large part of the feudal structure of European society, reform from the center of Western Christendom or the papacy appeared unlikely. And to this is one of my own scholia. Consider, however, how the center of Eastern Christendom was also often in heresy. Often. But did not produce a patriarchal monarchy. Although sometimes we do wonder, with the ecumenical patriarch, starting to sound and act more and more like these 10th century papal reformers. But change came with the accession of Pope Leo IX in 1049. Stirrings of renewal were also evident in monastic Europe, especially in the great Burgundian Abbey of Cluny, south of Dijon, founded by Duke William the Pious of Aquitaine in 910. This is going to become a very critical part of the papal reform movement, the rise of the Cluniac monasteries. The Pious, although purely monastic in origin, this renewal was later to provide Rome with some of its own inspiration and drive. Cluny's support of papal authority, clerical celibacy, and ecclesiastical centralization, that's the word that could be underlined, will prove crucial to the papacy's struggle for freedom. The Abbey of Cluny, thanks to the constitutional novelties of its charter and its pious founder, was able to avoid most of the spiritual and material decay characteristic of other monastic foundations at this time. The community placed itself under the immediate protection of the papacy and its patrons, St. Peter and St. Paul. Its direct and exclusive authority became in effect the distant pope. By being no longer subject to the will of its founder, Cluny ceased to be a proprietary monastery. External intervention, a basic reason of so much monastic and ecclesiastical decline elsewhere, was through St. Peter's protection formally and perpetually disallowed. Can you already anticipate how this is going to become a model for the papal reformers? The centralized authority of the Cluniac monastery system. This and other factors gave Cluny an independence not enjoyed by other ecclesiastical institutions in Western Christendom. By the late 11th century, some 2,000 monasteries were legally dependent on Cluny, not on a king or an emperor, but on the abbot of Cluny. Apart from this arrangement, in which the entire Cluny congregation was treated as a single, centralized monastery directly dependent on the Mother Abbey in Burgundy, that produced a monastic empire, a monastic subculture, like an underground artesian spring running throughout Europe. It is arguable that without this, the radical reformation of the Roman papacy would not have happened. The papal reform movement of the 11th century would produce both vigorous fruits, which would be a revitalized and confident Europe, and tares, the seeds of division from apostolic Christianity and fragmentation of the Western Church, and the nihilism coming out of the program of the philosophes, the Enlightenment, so-called, of the 18th century. The Enlightenment, they hated the church. They hated it. Their program was to destroy the church. And that's what we're seeing now. The 20th century nonsense, 21st century nonsense that we're seeing now is just the continuation of the Enlightenment. Almost all the Gregorian papal reformers were of non-Roman origin and actually hail from the centralized monasteries in Burgundy and Lorraine patterned after Cluny. Initially, says Papadakis, the reform movement was non-Roman in inspiration and origin. At first, little more than a talented band of Rhineland monastics. It was not from Rome nor Italy, but from outside, as was the Lutheran Reformation, that will come 200-300 years later, that the first reformer popes came. I just think that's very interesting historically. The papal reformers in the 11th century come from Germany, and then the Protestant Reformation in the 15th century is centered in Germany. But the agenda of these reformer popes, unlike the Lutheran Reformation, was by no means carried out in defiance or in spite of the papacy. The transformation of the papacy into a forceful agency of renewal begins with the enthronement of Pope Leo IX in 1049 to 1054. He was a German Emperor Henry's cousin. He, says Papadakis, is the real founder of the so-called Gregorian reform, and not Gregory VII, after whom the papal reform is named. From the outset, Leo IX was determined to make the papacy an instrument of spiritual and moral rejuvenation, both in Rome itself and throughout Europe. Now, who can criticize his agenda, his intention? The numerous regional reforming synods held during his lengthy sojourns across the Alps, back and forth, often had as their target the traffic in ecclesiastical offices and unchaste clergy. The object of these reforming synods that he would hold all over was above all to rid the church of these abuses by restoring canonical discipline. What am I saying here? Oh, yes, I'm referring here to Archbishop Daniel's talk about when he talked to us about the canonical tradition. How the canonical discipline of the church is really meant to heal. It's meant to heal. And to keep things beautiful, keep things in proportion, keep things faithful and loyal. You have to keep things faithful to the Eucharist. The need to reassert both the validity and binding power of canon law for all clergy was repeatedly emphasized. It would be critical then how canon law was understood, this is my scholium, as a juridical requirement or as the incarnation of divine eros that made theosis possible. This is what Bishop Daniel was telling us about the canonical tradition. The canon law is not, it has a juridical face, obviously, and it is applied juridically. But its purpose is not to bind you to the authority of a bishop. Its purpose is to make it possible for you to become divinized, to be saved. The immediate impact of this flurry of activity was often extraordinary. Contemporaries were astonished by the papal posture. To say it once more, the papacy until then really had no sense of itself as an international body with broad responsibilities for the world beyond the Alps or for Christian Europe. Until then, Rome had rarely interfered outside Italy. By contrast, in 1049, it was being extolled as the undisputed center of Latin Christendom, the supremely divinely ordained authority of the Church Universal. The Church of Rome was on the threshold of a new age. Under Leo IX, the duties of the cardinalate were also reorganized and enlarged and consciously internationalized, paralleling the internationalization of the papacy. The cardinals, too, nominated by Pope Leo, were virtually all outsiders. Until now, the duties of all cardinals were purely liturgical. Their titles did not denote positions of authority. but by appointing them as papal co-workers, legates, and supervisors. Leo transformed them into his immediate principal counselors or advisors. They were transformed into policymakers and administrators of papal departments, and they were given a leading role in the election of a new pope, in contrast to the practice before, when the papacy would be determined by the king or the emperor. The cardinalate, in effect, was an imitation of the ancient Roman Senate. The cardinalate has retained this role to this day. Before 1046, there was no existing blueprint for reform. A practical program of reform materialized only in 1046, or more accurately in 1049 during Leo's enlightened pontificate. It was this particular pope, together with his dedicated circle of friends and reformers, with their integrity and exemplary moral life, who set the pace for the movement as a whole. What could not be foreseen was the scale of the offensive, its suddenness, the coherent ideology which was developed to support it, and the decisive impact it was to have on the whole history of the Western Church. In the course of 25 years, the popes began to intervene vigorously in the affairs of other churches and became the leaders of an international movement. The champions of reform proved more unyielding than their often more numerous adversaries. You know, it occurs to me that the papal reform movement was centralized, and it was asserting itself into a society that was decentralized and fragmented. All the feudal magnates and lords, their own fiefdoms, so the battlefield was already divided. Divide and conquer. It was already divided. So it seems to me that this would be one reason why the papal reform movement was able to overwhelm its adversaries, which were more numerous than the papal reformers. It's because they were centralized. Not to mention that they had as their support all those monasteries of Cluny. That monastic empire, that subculture that was throughout Europe. This was particularly evident in the skillful drive of the reformers to make celibacy an absolute prerequisite to ordination. This part of the Gregorian platform was reinforced by the monastic ideal, since many of the reformers were actually monks and already embraced a continent life. And keep in mind that what they're trying to reform is the sexual unchastity of the priests. So what better way than to make them monks? Of course, the problem was that many of the monks were also unchaste. But now you've got Cluny again coming into the picture. So you have this whole army of chaste, celibate men, with an exemplary moral life, who are going after the corruption in European society with a powerful force. Some, like the ascetic Peter Damian, who was Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, were even eager to treat the problem as heresy and not as a matter of discipline. But the reformers were perhaps also uncompromising on this issue, because they were convinced that compulsory clerical continence could advance the process of de-laicization, another more general item of their platform. A monasticized priesthood was viewed by the reformers everywhere as providing the clergy with that sense of solidarity and corporate identity needed to distinguish them from the laity. In all essential respects, the reforming initiatives of the popes were an attempt by men trained in the monastic discipline to remodel church and society according to monastic ideals, to train churchmen to think of themselves as a distinct order with a lifestyle truly different from that of laymen. I mean, listen to this. This is very significant. Behind the campaign for celibacy in some, aside from moral and canonical issues involved, was the desire to set all churchmen, that would be priests and bishops and monastics, apart from and above the laity. The need to create a spiritual elite by the separation of the priests from the ordinary layman. This was an urgent priority. In the end, the Gregorian priesthood did achieve a certain liberty and even a sense of community, but only at the expense of a sharp opposition between itself and the rest of society. You catch that? That's big. We can consider, this looks like an Ascolian for me. We can consider how this would affect the culture of Western society and the experience of the Christian faith and of the church. The subtle impact this would have on an understanding of sexuality, of marriage, of women. By contrast, in the Christian East, as in primitive Christianity, a holy celibate priesthood never became the norm, nor was it ever transformed into a requirement for ordination. The condemnation against celibacy as an absolute prerequisite to the clerical rights was repeatedly repudiated by both local and ecumenical councils, beginning with Nicaea. The condemnation enshrined in Canon 3 of the Sixth Ecumenical Council was explicit. If anyone shall have dared, contrary to the apostolic canons, to deprive any of those who are in holy orders of cohabitation and intercourse with his lawful wife, let him be deposed. If any presbyter or deacon on pretense of piety has dismissed his wife, let him be excluded from communion. And if he persevere in this, let him be deposed. In the East, even bishops were allowed to marry until the 6th century. The self-conscious monasticized clergy imposed on the Western Church by the Gregorian enthusiasts was ultimately alien both to Christian antiquity and the medieval Byzantine Church. Okay, now this is not me anymore. This is Papadegas. At this point, I fly over the historical events and factors leading to the establishment of the papal monarchy to talk about the ideological program of the papal reformers. In addition to the demand for libertas, or freedom, and spiritual renewal, a determined effort had been made by the papacy to see that its claims to a universal jurisdiction throughout Christendom were everywhere acknowledged. The reformers, in fact, resolved to reorganize the church along monarchical lines. From the outset, it was agreed that this was to be accomplished by the systematic promotion of the Pope's ancient primacy and authority everywhere. In brief, from the beginning, the pioneers of the Reformation were convinced that an independently powerful papacy exercising direct jurisdictional control over Christendom was an indispensable preliminary condition to renewal, given the circumstances that we described in the Western Europe, in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. Can you understand why the papacy would be thinking like that? Papal reformers would be thinking like this. They're not going to renew Europe if they're going to be nice about it, or if they're going to operate according to consensus. They've got to assert themselves. The idea that the reform was to be founded on the restoration of papal authority was soon standard sentiment. Any concession or compromise in the Pope's alleged constitutional status of the Church Universal was conceived as a threat to the movement as a whole. Roman primatial centralism could alone guarantee ecclesial unity and renewal. Evidently, the papal reform movement was never limited or restricted to spiritual or moral renewal. So the point that I'm making is that it was not just an ideological program. It was not this drive to make the Pope into some kind of a despot. It was driven also, and perhaps kind of viscerally, by this fear of corrupt Europe, and an effort to and a desire not to return to that. So that it was not just ideological; it also was practical. The tenure of Gregory VII as pontiff in the 11th century is when the papal reform's theme of papal primacy achieved a degree of practical and theoretical development unknown to the first reform pioneers. The mystical identification with St. Peter, occasionally cultivated by the popes of the early Middle Ages, first acquired its more extreme and indeed bizarre interpretation under Hildebrand. That's what his name was when he was the papal legate. He was the one, I think, who went to Constantinople and threw down the bull of excommunication, and then he became the Pope, Gregory VII. The Petrus mystique, or the identification of Peter, the papacy's identity as Peter, the Petrus mystique, dominates his reign. Gregory's Dictatus Papae is a collection of 27 short statements dealing with the Roman papacy. It is one of the most synoptic manifestos in existence on the subject. The arbitrary terms in which the fullness of Roman universal power is described is unparalleled. The suggestion has been made that the list was intended as an index or a list of sorts, a table of contents or chapter headings for a lost collection of canon law on the primacy. Again, the question, if so, how would this affect one's understanding of canon law relative to Archbishop Daniel's presentation on the canonical tradition as the embodiment of the mystery of the Incarnation, rooted in divine love and centered on the Eucharist? I mean, do you get it well enough to understand what I'm trying to say? That in the papal reform movement, canon law would be conceived not as the incarnation of divine love, but rather as a set of rules and regulations by which you could be considered saved. You got to be with the Pope. And these are the rules that you got to follow. In other words, a purely forensic, juridical understanding of canon law as a legal, not as an incarnation of divine love at all, but as rules, as law. So again, it makes me wonder, the Protestant reformers, they were all exercised over law and grace. And I wonder if they had this understanding of canon law working in their mind. And this is what corrupted their understanding of the law in the Old Testament. So that they just got it completely wrong. All right. Here are some historical circumstances that were to produce the problem that the papal reform movement was trying to address. What do we want to say about this? The barbarian invasions was the problem. And at least in my mind, it's the theological reflections on historical circumstances. Historical circumstances are always with us in this world. They are always threatening faithfulness to the gospel, always persuading us to accommodate or to relax Christian discipline, if not to abandon the discipline of the cross altogether, both on the level of society, the Christian community, and the Christian believer personally. This is the case. So the barbarians presented a real problem. And the papal reformers trying to address that problem kind of lost sight. From the Eastern perspective, they lost sight of the cross. They lost sight of the Incarnation. They turned the Christian faith into a set of legal precepts in which you are bound by the Pope, bound to the Pope. Problems that were produced by the barbarian invasions. One would be loss of contact with the Eastern Church, which would include loss of protection, communication, but also a cutting off from Eastern Christian mentorship. And this would be significant because, most of the spiritual theological writings are from the East. And even now, I think of Father Dan Latier perhaps as an example. He was Roman Catholic, and he married Kelly. He became Byzantine Catholic. And his observation was that he found himself, for spiritual nourishment, reading always from Eastern sources. That's what got him to thinking. Remember Father Dan Latier? Does anybody remember Father Dan Latier? Yeah, you would. They were received into St Herman's, 10, 12 years ago or so. Well, I don't know, but I want to take the time here to... I think we would want fresh minds. to reflect on these questions. This is kind of getting into a theological assessment of history. I want to look, let me see if I can find some quotes that I wanted to share with you. So let me read this to you from page 49. This is after Papadakis presents the Dictatus Papae and makes a few comments on the Dictatus Papae. Look at the chapter 22, for example. The Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err, to all eternity. Scripture being witness. I don't know of any Eastern Orthodox Christian who would say that, of the Orthodox Church. I mean, the Orthodox Church in her spiritual substance, yes. But goodness sakes, how many times has the Orthodox Church, the patriarchs, bishops, fallen into heresy? Suffice it to say, Roman papal claims reached their pinnacle with such arguments that you find in the Dictatus Papae. Reformers were actually being redundant in transforming obedience to the Pope into virtual dogma, or in declaring conciliar legislation invalid just because it contradicted papal decrees. This boggles my mind. Let me make sure you're catching it. They declare that not even councils, the councils of bishops, can contradict the Pope. That is mind-boggling. It is unprecedented.
Well, they have to do that. Otherwise, Chalcedon would prevent them from changing the creed.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're kind of stuck.
Well, I wouldn't say they were stuck, but they stuck themselves, maybe. Arguably, their 12th century successors were conscious of their petition, as their search for new formulas and titles seems to suggest. It was then for the first time, in fact, that the label Vicar of Christ, normally used of the emperor, you know what Vicar of Christ means? In the place of Christ, presupposing then that Christ is absent, was moved center stage as a replacement of sorts for the Pope's inherited personal sanctity and mystical identification with Peter. By the end of the century, Innocent III was even ready to discard the old formula Vicar of St. Peter altogether for the more comprehensive Vicar of Christ. As he was to emphasize, we are the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, but we are not his vicar, nor the vicar of any man or apostle, but the vicar of Jesus Christ himself. Parenthetically, in connection with this terminological evolution, it is interesting to note that the word ecclesia, or church, was also to undergo a transformation of sorts at the same period. By then, now listen to this and see if this doesn't match your understanding of the church that you had before you found the Orthodox Church. By then, the word had come to be identified exclusively with churchmen, or ecclesiastical government. In other words, the bishop, the priest, the deacon. Not even the deacon, just the Pope and his cardinals. As Archbishop Daniel said, the bishops of the Roman Church are basically branch managers. It was quite common, in fact, to speak of ecclesiastical hierarchy or authority as the church, to the exclusion of the laity. To the exclusion of the laity. In other words, the meaning of the biblical term ecclesia, embracing, as it has always done, the entire body of the faithful, was obscured or forgotten. Now, I think that if you were to read a Roman Catholic take on this, they might say the same things, but instead of saying it as a criticism, they would say it as an established fact. That's what the church is. The church is the churchman, it's the bishop, the college of bishops. That's what the church is. Language like this is a sign of a very profound revolution in the way men thought about the church. What is uppermost in their minds when they think of the church is a juridical entity. How many of you have grown up with an understanding of the church as a juridical entity, as a court of law? How many of you have grown up with the understanding of salvation as being pronounced innocent, even though you're guilty, in a court of law? One speaks of the body of the church as one does of any corporation. Looked at in terms of a juridical organization, the church is seen essentially as a hierarchical, governmental structure, rather than as a Eucharistic community. It goes without saying that the clerical separatism enshrined in this definition of church is linked not only to a rising papalism, but also to a rising clericalism. Everywhere in the West, by the 12th century, in contrast with the more accessible, monogamous clergy of Eastern Christendom, priestly celibacy had become an enduring reality. Well, what do you think? I think that's rather illuminating. I think it helps to explain what drove the Protestant Reformation. An effort to recover the corporate, the communal experience of apostolic experience of the church. How does this monarchy, where you have the king and then all of his subjects, and then even the king at the top is the only one who has access to God. And if you want to have access to God, it's got to be through the king. So you got to be loyal to the king. Otherwise, you're out of communion with God. Where in the Orthodox Church would that center be? Paul?
But don't, having read like St. Ignatius' letters, isn't the Eucharist sort of through the bishop and through the priest?
Yes.
So don't we sort of have
Well, think about that, Paul. What's the difference?
well, it's a truncated pyramid, not a full pyramid, I don't know.
But what makes the bishop is the Eucharist. Bishop, it's the in the confession of faith. That's what makes the bishop. You understand? The bishop doesn't decide what the confession of faith is. And even the bishops throughout the ecumenical councils, they weren't deciding what the faith is. They were trying to articulate what the faith is and what's given to us. They weren't creating the faith. You understand what I'm trying to say?
They wouldn't say that. I doubt the Catholics would say that. They're trying to create the faith either.
Well, I know they wouldn't. I know they would. That's what makes it so interesting.
Fair to them,
What's that?
Just to be fair.
No, but that's what makes it so interesting to me. They would not say that. But then how are they going to explain these unprecedented claims of the papacy that do not appear until the 10th century? That's what boggles my mind. How can you be blind to that?
Is
Yeah.
that just like a Germanic kind of cultural thing? Because I'm thinking of Hitler and the Nazis, seems kind of...
One can note the apparent parallels, and
similar,
might make an interesting
rise of
paper for some
power.
class to explore that. I don't know. But anyway, for me, this reveals a lot about how the Protestant Church developed, how it arose, what it was responding to. So I guess it helps me to understand my own formation in the Protestant churches. It helps to clarify for me some of the issues that were shaping me. So, any questions, observations, comments from you? Yes, Michael?
Yeah, you mentioned the vicar of Christ is in place of Christ. Isn't that also another name for the Antichrist too, is in place of Christ?
Right, yeah,
Interesting.
I don't know that I'd make too much out of that.
No, just a thought.
Yes, Kyle?
Wasn't there like a crusade going on at the same time?
Yes, yes. Well, not yet. The Crusades are just around the corner. When was the first one? 1198 or so? 1204? Yeah. And that certainly did a lot to destroy relationships between the East and the West.
Because they'd have to go through Constantinople, right?
Well, that was their objective, to deliver Constantinople from the Muslim pagans or infidels.
It was their stated objective,
Yeah.
but many of the principles of the Crusade are just lose.
Yes.
Bohemond, the first.
I mean, they're going to come head to head with the Orthodox, like the Eastern Church.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, was that kind of an ulterior motive or something?
I think, yes, they wanted to subjugate the Orthodox Church to the Roman Pope. Yes, they did. And then when the Eastern Church was, when Byzantium was threatened by the Persians from the east, and was seeking military aid, that was one of the catches that the papal court used to promise their military support. It was how they were able to bring about the so-called formula of union, when the Patriarch of Constantinople and his bishops and the emperor traveled to Florence in Rome, was it? In Florence, Ferrara, and the so-called Council of Union was held, which is upheld by the Romans, by the Westerns, and is used as a reason to accuse the Easterners of betraying that formula, that Council of Union. But in that Council of Union, they promised military aid to the Byzantines if they would sign on to papal primacy, to the filioque, to purgatory, and to a whole bunch of other peculiarly Western doctrines. And the bishops did. Mark of Ephesus was the sole bishop who did not. So he's extolled as a saint. And also, to continue the story, when the Patriarch and his bishops who had signed that union came back to Constantinople, the faithful, even though they were threatened by invaders, would not let them into the churches. And as it turns out, the military aid didn't come anyway, because Rome wasn't capable of sending it. So anyway, there you have it. A Reader's Digest version. As you can imagine, it's a whole lot more complex than what you heard tonight. But at least, the purpose here is to give you a sense of the cause of the rift between East and West. That we're really looking at two. So for me personally, when I hear people wanting to say that the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church are fundamentally the same, I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. And there are academics who want to make that claim. I just don't buy it. I think that's irresponsible. All right, well then let's say a closing prayer and we'll be done. Name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Truly it is me to bless you with the Apostles, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond comparison than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God the Word. Truth, the Apostles, we magnify thee. Christ is in our midst.
Yes,
Yes,